Have you ever noticed how some people genuinely love being alone? Not in a sad, "no one invited me" way. Not in a dramatic, doors closed to the world way. But in a calm, almost relieved way. Like when plans get cancelled and instead of disappointment, they feel this quiet, internal yes. And maybe that person is you. Or maybe it's someone you know who seems perfectly content spending a Friday night with their thoughts, a book, or just the hum of their own space. We're often told that humans are social creatures, that connection is everything, that wanting too much solitude must mean something's wrong. But psychology paints a very different picture. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the assumption most people make. If you like being alone, you must be lonely. Or shy. Or antisocial. Or secretly unhappy. That assumption is everywhere. It's in how people react when you say you're staying in. It's in the jokes about introverts needing to come out of their shell. It's in the subtle pressure to explain yourself, as if choosing solitude requires a justification. But here's the reality. Liking being alone and feeling lonely are not the same thing. In fact, they often come from opposite psychological places. People who genuinely enjoy being alone tend to have a very specific relationship with their inner world. Their thoughts aren't something they're constantly trying to escape. Silence doesn't feel threatening. Empty space doesn't need to be filled immediately. And that alone already tells us something important about how their brain works. Think about how uncomfortable silence can feel for some people. The moment there's no external stimulation, they reach for their phone. They turn on a TV they're not even watching. They call someone just to hear a voice. That urge isn't random. For many people, constant input helps regulate emotion. It distracts from anxiety, boredom, or unresolved thoughts. But for people who like being alone, their nervous system is wired a little differently. Solitude doesn't spike anxiety. It often lowers it. Psychologists sometimes talk about baseline arousal levels. Some brains are naturally more sensitive to stimulation. Noise, crowds, constant interaction, they register more intensely. For those people, being alone isn't deprivation. It's regulation. It's how the system returns to balance. Imagine your brain is a glass of water. Social interaction keeps pouring more in. Alone time is when you finally set the glass down and let it settle. Not because you hate people, but because you don't want to spill. This is why people who enjoy being alone often feel drained by small talk but energized by depth. It's not that they don't care about others. It's that surface-level interaction doesn't give their brain much to work with. Their mind is constantly connecting dots, reflecting, replaying conversations, exploring ideas. When an interaction stays shallow, it can feel like chewing gum with no flavor. Meanwhile, a single meaningful conversation can fuel them for days. You'll also notice that people who like solitude tend to be very comfortable with delayed gratification. They're not always chasing the next hit of excitement. They can sit with boredom long enough for something interesting to emerge. That's not a small trait. From a psychological perspective, that ability is linked to creativity, problem-solving, and emotional maturity. Many breakthroughs, personal and historical, didn't happen in loud rooms. They happened in quiet ones, when someone finally had the space to think without interruption. There's also a strong link between enjoying solitude and self-trust. When you spend time alone, you're constantly making small decisions without external feedback. What do I want to do today? What do I think about this? How do I feel right now? Over time, that builds an internal compass. You're less dependent on approval because you're used to consulting yourself first. This is why people who like being alone often seem quietly confident. Not loud confidence. Not performative confidence. But a steady sense of, I know myself. That self-knowledge also makes them more selective socially. And this is where they're often misunderstood. They don't need many people, so others assume they don't care much. But usually it's the opposite. They care deeply, which is why they don't spread that energy everywhere. When you're comfortable alone, relationships become a choice, not a requirement. You're not hanging out to avoid discomfort. You're hanging out because you genuinely want to. This selectivity shows up in how they listen, too. People who like being alone are often exceptional listeners. They're used to paying attention to nuance, to what's not being said. They're not rushing to fill every pause. Silence doesn't scare them, so they let conversations breathe. And that makes others feel surprisingly seen. You'll hear people say things like, "I don't know why I'm telling you this," which is usually code for, "You feel safe." Another interesting trait is how they relate to emotions. Alone time creates a natural feedback loop. When you're by yourself, there's nowhere to outsource feelings. You notice them sooner. You process them more directly. That doesn't mean it's always pleasant. It just means you're familiar with your inner weather. Over time, that familiarity reduces fear. Emotions become information instead of emergencies. This is one reason people who like being alone often appear emotionally stable. Not unfeeling. Just steady. They're less reactive because they've already spent time sitting with their reactions privately. By the time they show up in the world, the emotional storm has already passed through. There's also something to be said about imagination. Solitude is fertile ground for it. When there's no constant input, the brain fills the space itself. Daydreaming. Reflecting. Running scenarios. This is why many writers, artists, thinkers, and innovators crave alone time. Their best ideas don't show up on demand in group settings. They arrive quietly, often when no one is watching. Of course, liking being alone doesn't mean you're immune to loneliness. Anyone can feel lonely. The difference is that for these people, loneliness isn't cured by just adding more people. It's cured by the right people, or sometimes by reconnecting with themselves. They're more likely to ask, "Am I missing connection, or am I just overstimulated?" That distinction matters. There's also a moral component that doesn't get talked about enough. People who like being alone tend to have a strong sense of values. When you're not constantly absorbing other people's opinions, you have more space to develop your own. You think about what matters to you, not just what's trending or socially rewarded. That can make you seem unconventional. Sometimes even stubborn. But often it just means you're living from the inside out. Interestingly, research on personality consistently shows that people who prefer solitude score higher on traits like openness to experience and introspection. They're curious about ideas, about meaning, about how things fit together. They don't need constant novelty because their mind is already busy. A quiet afternoon can feel rich when your inner life is active. And then there's the boundary piece. People who enjoy being alone are usually very aware of their limits. They know when they're done. When their energy is depleted. When it's time to go home. This self-awareness can look like rigidity to others, but it's actually a form of self-respect. They're not being difficult. They're listening to their system. If you're someone who likes being alone, you've probably felt pressure to change that at some point. To be more social. More outgoing. More available. But here's the reframe that psychology supports. Solitude, when chosen, is not avoidance. It's alignment. It's a sign that you know what helps you function at your best. And if you're someone who doesn't relate to this, that's okay too. Not every brain needs the same balance. Some people regulate through connection. Others through reflection. Neither is superior. Problems only arise when we assume one way of being is the default, and everything else is a deviation. So if you find peace in your own company, if you think better when things are quiet, if your best moments come when the world finally leaves you alone, there's nothing broken about you. You're not missing out on life. You're experiencing it differently. And often more deeply. Maybe the most interesting thing about people who like being alone is that they don't actually want less connection. They want better connection. With themselves. With others. With what they choose to give their energy to. And that's not isolation. That's intention. If this resonated, you don't need to change anything about how you are. Just notice it. Notice what solitude gives you. Notice how your mind behaves when it has room to breathe. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to hear how alone time shows up in your life. Or you can just sit with this quietly, the way you probably prefer. Either way, understanding yourself a little more is always worth the time.